and welcome to Madison's Notes, the official podcast of Princeton University's James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions. I'm your host, Annika Nordquist. Today's guest is Rita Koganzon, professor of political science at the University of Houston, formerly of the University of Virginia. During this discussion, we talk about her most recent book, Liberal States' Authoritarian Families, Childhood and Education in Early Modern Thought. Over the course of that discussion, we cover a lot of ground, both about the educational views of the past and the present, particularly during a period where issues like parents' rights, children's rights, homeschooling, and where authority is appropriate in a classroom are so prevalent in political discussions. I think going back to the root of those ideas is a really necessary and important conversation. So with no further ado, I really hope you enjoy this conversation. Rita, welcome to the show. It's lovely to have you.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
How did you come to fixate on this particular topic about early modern thought on education?
Well, I've always been interested in education, and particularly from my own experience of education, one of the things that sort of stood out for me going to just like sort of average public schools in America, or the suburbs of Chicago, was that my teachers didn't seem to want to exercise authority over us. They, in fact, tried to sort of avoid doing that and sort of, you would have this kind of ethic of I'm your friend, actually, or I'm your peer, which was like the worst because they would be like really old and not our peers in the most obvious ways, but trying really hard. And I was just kind of puzzled about why they took that sort of position. And then when I got to the university, I sort of encountered for the first time teachers who were perfectly willing to sort of assert authority. I mean, in a different way, not disciplinary authority in the case at the university, but sort of the authority of knowledge and understanding these texts. And I sort of stopped rebelling as much. So I was kind of a bad kid in school and got suspended a couple of times for, in fact, being insubordinate. Which I found to be like a very puzzling claim, because how could I be insubordinate to people who didn't want to assert any authority? Right. And that sort of just kind of vanished at the university because I felt like these people really knew something, that they had something to teach, and that it was sort of my place to, shut up and listen and try to understand and to understand the books in the way that they understood them. And so that experience was sort of surprising to me. And I kind of looked back at my K through 12 education and wondered why adults didn't want to do that earlier, right? Why adults who clearly knew much more than me when I was 8, right? Or 10 or 15 didn't want to assert that kind of authority. So most of my research actually comes out of sort of the puzzles of my own experience of education. And so this was one of those puzzles. And, in reading in college, actually, when I read Locke and Rousseau for the first time, and especially when I encountered Locke's education treatise and Rousseau's The Meal, I sort of saw this very different approach to education, where on the one hand, you could understand why the teachers that I had didn't want to assert their authority because it was sort of anti-democratic. And our regime doesn't really support this hierarchical understanding where I am just in a position of authority over somebody because I know something more, I'm wiser, I have more experience or something like that. It's just automatic, right? I didn't have to earn it. I didn't have to show my credentials. I didn't really have to get elected by them. I mean, that's the main way that we sort of create authority, is to say well, you voted for me. Of course, students don't vote for their teachers. And so it's kind of incongruent with the regime. In our civic lives, we're always taught to treat everyone else as equals. And I think in a deep sense, we feel other people to be our equals, right? So you don't abuse people at the grocery store because they're the checkout clerk and you're the customer. You're sort of nice to them because, you could be the checkout clerk too. Maybe you were the checkout clerk when you were 15, right? And so there's a sense of civic equality that's really incongruent with this idea that over children, or in certain circumstances, we're supposed to have a really hierarchical relationship. And so what was interesting to me about Locke and Rousseau is that they're liberals in the sense that they recognize human equality in this basic sense, and civic equality especially, but they still reserve the necessity of hierarchical relationships in the family and in education. And they're not willing to say, well, we've got to relinquish that just because in general, we understand ourselves to be civic equals. And in fact, if we want to have civic equality for adults, we actually have to exercise this really hierarchical sort of authority over children, which seemed intuitively true to me from my own experience of education, that in general, that the teachers, the professors I had who were more willing to be authoritative were much better than the ones who were like, I'm actually your friend, I'm actually cool too, like, let me into your peer group, right? I mean, you can sort of, I'm sure a lot of people have experiences with adults like that, like they're just really ineffectual.
Yeah, no, it is so funny that you say that, because I feel like my educational experience was so similar. It's just hard to respect people who don't demand respect. And then I went to university in California, which it was just like a constant sort of humorous tussle about, my professors all wanted to be called by their first names. And I was like, I'm not doing it. Like, you can't make me. But it's so interesting, this idea that kind of comes through in your book. I mean, Americans are so allergic, I think, to authority kind of in every way. And it seems like ideologically people, are kind of divided between more authority, the better. And you kind of get the Hobbes on this, where the ultimate goal is authority, 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 or the American way of thinking about it, where it's like less authority. We don't want any authority. We're trying to train people so that they'll never have any authority. How do these philosophers, I mean, because to me, it just seems so obvious that there ought to be a balance between those two. Do any of these philosophers you talk about address that, or address the idea that maybe somewhere in the middle is the solution?
Well, it's not so much the middle, it's that there's different spheres or different realms, right, in which we relate to each other in different ways. I mean, Tocqueville really, I think, draws this problem out very well, right, when he says, like, basically Democrats want democracy all the way down. They want to make everything democratic. Yeah. And they don't realize that that actually undermines democracy, right, if you take it all the way to sort of its extreme point. And so you have to bring these aristocratic elements kind of consciously back in. And one of the places where he's concerned about it actually is the family. He doesn't really talk much about education and democracy in America. He just says people get some education, but he's not interested in the structure of schools or anything like that. But he does say, there's this problem, which is that the logic of democracy is thorough, and it doesn't stop at certain institutions or certain spheres. But probably the proper way to think about it, and this is the way that for Locke especially, he thinks about it, right, is that you have the two treatises, especially the second treatise, which is a kind of treatise about political, structures. And there he posits civic equality, right? And there's no qualification of that. It's not that, well, we're civically equal here, but not there. It's just here I'm talking about the public sphere or the public realm. And in the public realm, we are civic equals, and there is no qualification to that. And then you have this book on education, which is seemingly very much at odds with that. I mean, one of the first things he says is your children ought to look at you as lords, to fathers. Even though he's just written this whole treatise saying, like, nobody is a lord, right? Nobody has this kind of arbitrary authority over somebody else. And so it seems like if you try to think this through, right, it seems that the family is one sphere. And he's especially adamant to have the family be really separate from civic life, right? That you sort of withdraw into your family when you have children. What he's describing, the kind of education that he's formulating and proposing for the person that he's writing this treatise to, kind of requires total, absorption. You're homeschooling your kids effectively on an estate somewhere in the country. You're not really near other people. You're not really engaged in social life. I mean, in broader society, you're not in London. And so there's a kind of withdrawal from civic society during this period of time that you're educating your children, so that the separation is, in a sense, even more obvious and extreme than it would be if we were to say, well, there's education, obviously, in a liberal regime. You send your kid to a school, right? That's like a couple blocks from your house or something like that, right? And there you see a lot more integration of, the family is just part of the city, and the city is part of the country, and we're all sort of public all the time. Whereas for Locke, it's like, no, you withdraw to the country, and, you don't see other people that often. You don't see society, especially high society, that often. And there's a real separation there.
And it's interesting. It reminds me very much of Polybius, if you're familiar, the idea of like balancing aristocratic and democratic ideals and oligarchic together to create a form of education.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of the mixed regime is really interesting, right? Because Locke is writing in response to Hobbes and Bodin, and these are the people I talk about at the beginning of the book, the absolutists. And the absolutist argument, the argument for absolute sovereignty, starting in Bodin, is there can be no such thing as a mixed regime. There never has been a mixed regime. Ultimately, there is a sovereign in every regime, and that sovereign has this kind of, as Schmitt formulates it, final power. And so the mixed regime is a kind of illusion that Polybius, who we mentioned, is describing. And Locke, although he accepts a lot of the arguments that, come out of Hobbes, especially about rights and natural equality and things like that, doesn't talk about sovereignty. I mean, it's a notable absence in the second treatise. He never uses the term. He talks about how the legislature is supreme, but then when you look at what the legislature can do, it turns out that it's basically looks like, the American Congress. There's all these checks and balances, and there's, the monarch has powers, and, there's other parts of the government. So he's a kind of anti-sovereignty thinker, I think. And you see the sort of in the beginning of the second treatise where he says, there's different ways of ruling people. I mean, it's sort of the invocation of Aristotle's politics at the beginning, that there's household rule, there's political rule, and then there's rule over slaves. And so, I think that's right to say that for Locke, there is a kind of partial return to the mixed regime, although now he has to take on board these critiques that he's, had to deal with in the early modern period, the sovereignty critiques that say, look, there's really no such thing as ultimately mixed power, that there has to be kind of a final locus of power.
So talk to me a little bit about congruence. You talk a lot about it in your book, but it seems very relevant to what we were just discussing. I mean, this question of whether or not the family structure should in some way mirror the structure of the state. Is it the case that the same principles, say, of mixed government, of authority, or of what have you, apply to both? Or is it the case that there are sort of separate ideal forms that are maybe, in fact, complementary or opposite?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the question of whether there can be a mixed regime, right? Whether you can have different principles operating in different spheres. And so I think, what's really interesting about, Bodin is not widely read. Partly it's because hasn't been translated into English for 400 years. So
yeah, let's actually dip back and explain to our listeners who that is.
Yeah, so Jean Bodin is a 16th century French political theorist who wrote a couple important books, the most important or widely read of which is called The Six Books of the Republic. And he sort of formulates the theory of sovereignty, right? Which is that there is a locus of power in the state that has, as he puts it, sort of jurisdiction over five things, like the pardoning power, the power to declare war. I mean, he has a whole list. But Carl Schmitt in the 20th century kind of helpfully narrows it, sort of flattens it to the final say, somebody who gets the final say in the regime. And I think that's not a totally unfair characterization of what Bodin was describing, although Bodin's description is more complicated than that. And that's a really shocking sort of claim, because really, even in the Renaissance, there's an understanding of the regime, the mixed regime, as a kind of ideal constitution.
Right.
So you have, the king, but there's also not exactly a legislature, but some kind of aristocratic body that kind of, moderates the king. So in France, that'd be the parlements, which are, judicial sort of bodies of aristocrats. And then you have, the people, and the people have certain prerogatives too. And plus in feudalism, you have different families with their particular prerogatives, and you have corporations that have their particular prerogatives. And there's no final power in a regime. It's all, the balancing of all of these different prerogatives. And Bodin says, no, all of that is flattened under the sovereign. And you could have a democratic sovereign, you can have an aristocratic sovereign, but both of those are really not so convenient. What you really want is a monarchical sovereign. And that's, Hobbes makes that point even more strongly. So, Hobbes follows Bodin in certain things. I think Hobbes is a much more sophisticated thinker than Bodin, and is interested also in psychology in ways that Bodin doesn't really take into account. And so that becomes kind of the argument. I mean, that's the argument to challenge and to deal with in the 17th century when you think about what is a regime.
Right.
And so part of what they do too, when it comes to the public and the private, is to make the case that you can't have a different structure of the family than the regime. In fact, the family is a really useful educative tool, because if you structure the family like an absolute monarchy, then children will learn obedience to an absolute monarch right from the cradle, essentially, right? Because their father will be a kind of surrogate absolute monarch within the family. And so you want to structure the family, and Bodin is very sort of, explicit that we have to reformulate the family. We have to change what the family is to make it more like this. Because in fact, French fathers don't have, there's this Roman power of life and death,
Right.
where the Roman father has the right to put his own sons to death. And he doesn't have to consult a jury or a judge about that. And that had been sort of abolished by Christianity. And Bodin calls for its return. And the reason that he wants that back is because it, of course, makes the father more like an absolute monarch. Right now, he has these real powers. He can kill you. And so you should regard him in the way, at least more like the way that you would regard your monarch, your sovereign. And Hobbes, in a complicated way, also uses that structure, right? Also says we have to kind of reformulate the family so that it's structured more like the model of the state. So they start with this model of an absolute monarchy in the state, and then they want to restructure the family so it more sort of effectively replicates that experience. And that's congruence, right?
Yeah.
So the family is congruent with the state.
Yeah, I know that example of I know my Roman history brain gets so frustrated when I hear that example, because I think the idea is that, oh, well, the father would never want to kill his son.
Right.
So, but of course, I don't know. In actuality, Romans use this all the time. If you have an unwanted infant and you leave it out, it was how, especially sex slavery and things like that, 100% people were using this, taking infants that were left out to die or what have you in Rome. So it's a frustrating claim for me.
Yeah, well, Bodin says, of course, you would never want to do this, right? So, he's trying to reassure people,
Yeah.
We're going to bring back this barbaric practice. Don't worry, it's not really that barbaric. Fathers love their children. They don't want to just wantonly kill them, but you have to give them at least the possibility of doing so in order to create that structure of, fear and obedience that would replicate how a subject should sort of understand his sovereign relative to himself.
I know. Well, it's just frustrating because it's not true. Roman fathers absolutely did.
The French didn't try it. They didn't take him up on it.
But I guess, so then looking at that, how do we think now about similarities and differences between the authority of the sovereign and the authority of a parent? How does that progress? Do later philosophers challenge that view of Hobbes that they need to be just the same kind of authority?
Yeah, liberalism generally challenges that kind of congruence, at least early liberalism. Then it kind of, as it gets sort of infused with democracy, that sort of falls away, and we can talk about that in a second. But one of the things that Locke does that really diverges from Hobbes is to say, no, there is no congruence between the family and the state, right? That we don't need to use the family as a kind of model state, that actually the education that we want for citizenship is a kind of inversion of the actual practice of citizenship, that you don't teach people to be sort of civic equals by having them at the age of 3 practice civic equality with their parents, because they're not in a position, they don't have the rationality to do that. And in fact, it would destroy them to do that, because what it would do is inflame their passions and make it impossible for them to develop a kind of strong will that can control their passions. And in order to develop that, which is the sort of, we would just call it self-control, sort of, as in a common way, to develop that kind of self-control, you actually need a lot of authority over you as a child when you're least able to naturally control yourself. So you can practice self-control, not that you practice equality and freedom. Right. In fact, you practice, suppressing your desires, so that when you're an adult and you can bring your reason to bear on, your desires, and then select those desires which are reasonable and sort of reject those other desires in you that you think are unreasonable. So Locke sees that as kind of the correct education for freedom. So the only way that you would not have to have an absolute despotic government controlling you is if you could control yourself. Right. And then you need a certain kind of education to be able to do that. And that education is an authoritarian education that develops your will and your ability to control your desires. And then you can sort of be free from government as an adult. That requires a lot of government as a child. So, and Rousseau follows him to a large extent in this sort of claim about what education requires, that education requires the kind of instilling of self-control. He sort of has two educations. One is like this totally natural one where you would just never have the wrong desires. But then it turns out once you put Emil into society, it's like not that compatible with society. So he sort of has to restart at adolescence and say, no, now it's kind of about controlling your desires, because you do have these wayward desires that would undermine society if you were to act on them. So those two arguments about education are more interested in the development of self-control, and they see authority as really essential, adult authority, parental and educative authority, as essential to that development of self-control. And we still are very Lockean, I think, in our understanding of education, though, it's hard to see we don't think of ourselves that way because we don't read Locke, or we don't read the education treatise, but it's really there. But at the same time, democracy kind of chips away at that distinction because it's not intuitive. The intuitive thing is actually what Bodin and Hobbes believed, except for democracy, which is that if you want to train people to be a certain way, you just do that to them from childhood. They practice those habits and then they treat everybody as equals, right? If we just make you treat everybody as equals from the beginning, you'll treat everybody as equals all the time. If we, make you free from the beginning, then you'll be free. You'll be a free citizen when you grow up. And it's actually very complicated in your mind to hold this position where you say, actually, what you need is a lot of authority in childhood and then freedom in adulthood. That's kind of less intuitive than the family is a small state.
Right.
And so as liberalism itself becomes more egalitarian and more democratic in the 19th and 20th centuries, we sort of lose that Lockean, Rousseauian dichotomy between the family and the state. And we want to make the family more and more congruent with the state. So once by the time we get to the 1970s, with John Rawls and then the followers of Rawls who are writing about education and the family, they're arguing about democratic education. That's literally the title of Amy Gutman's book, or the liberal family. And so then it's about, we want to use the family to foster certain liberal and egalitarian norms in children so that when they grow up, they will practice them. And I think it is so intuitive that it's hard really to hold the earlier idea in your mind. So I think that has been sort of eroded. And we see that, among other places in your average public school, where you have the sort of attitude of teachers that the only way to be listened to by students is to be respected at their level, which is to sort of lower yourself to the level of a child.
Super interesting. It seems to me, because these texts that you're talking about, they were not written in democratic societies like the ones we live in, which is easy to forget because democratic societies read so much Locke and Rousseau, and it's kind of in the bones of American history. But in fact, they weren't written with America or with democracy in mind. They were written in a very kind of hierarchical society and written for families who were off on, some country estate, raising their children. Given that, how do you deal with importing lessons from them into kind of a mass public education society like the one that we actually have?
Yeah, that's the subject of my next book, actually, because I think
exciting.
America poses a kind of dilemma for us, right? Which is that you can't actually do what Locke and Rousseau are proposing, which is take your children out in the country and effectively homeschool them.
Yeah.
You can't do that on a mass scale. So we kind of came close, actually, during the pandemic. Everybody was suddenly homeschooling. But I don't think they loved it too much. Although the number of people who have stuck with it is actually much higher than it used to be. It used to be a very small percentage of people were homeschooling. And now there are many more who've stayed with it after the pandemic. And the United States is probably the most liberal with its homeschooling allowances. If you think about OECD countries or, the Western world, or however you want to think about it, developed countries, the United States has the fewest requirements and sort of the most freedom to homeschool your kids out of all of these places. So there is this kind of sense, it's recent, right? Homeschooling has only been legal really since the 80s.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was legal in the 19th century because no one was paying attention. There was no compulsory schooling. But once you had compulsory school laws, then homeschooling became effectively illegal. And compulsory school laws kind of finished spreading around the country the early 20th century during the progressive period. So then it became illegal to homeschool. And nobody wanted to, or very few people wanted to anyway at that point. And then there was a kind of movement starting in the 1960s, a strange kind of combination of sort of leftist hippies and conservative Christians who wanted to pull their kids out of schools because they had very different objections to the public schools or just to schooling in general. And they sort of created a legal strategy to legalize homeschooling. So that was done at the state level. But now, we're sort of the furthest along in that. But it's still the case that most people can never do it in a democracy for reasons sort of Tocqueville lays out. Everybody has to work for a living. And if you're working for a living, you don't have the time and the means to educate your children. So you need schools. And, Locke and Rousseau don't have much to say about, don't have much good to say about schools. Later, liberal thinkers do. I mean, Smith writes about how there should be a system of public schools, mostly for poor kids. And he says, well, rich families find ways. Mill also has, sort of important entry into this tradition where he talks about the way that school is kind of brainwashing you, but at the same time, like there have to be public schools, otherwise we can't really have liberalism. So there's a kind of tension between state school, the sort of state-run nature of schools and the necessity of schools. And he's already closer to a more democrat. I mean, he's writing in 19th century Britain, it's moving much more towards democracy. But yeah, I mean, the United States poses this really interesting dilemma, which is we need the schools, but we really sort of appreciate the Lockean fear about schools, which is that they are going to sort of disable students morally because they subject them to each other's authority. Because there's just not enough adults. The adults are not really good at exercising authority over large groups of kids. And so what you do is you follow each other. And students exercise authority over each other, but that authority is like really kind of nefarious a lot of the time. So bullying would be sort of the extreme example of it, but just like peer pressure, cliques, like everything about American middle school that you can think of, like that's exactly what Locke and Rousseau are afraid of, is that people are going to be formed by other, basically ignorant fools like themselves. And they're going to be made to follow fashion, especially because that's sort of the reigning monarch of child groups is fashion, the tyranny of fashion. And so it's what can Americans do if they appreciate that critique, but on the other hand, they have a practical problem, which is that they can't just retire to the country estate and hire a tutor or teach their kids themselves. And so I think, one of the answers to that is that our approach to schooling is really antagonistic in a way that's pretty unique, again, in sort of developed countries, OECD countries. I mean, we share it a little bit with Britain and other Anglophone countries, which is that we hate school. And we have, if you think about our popular culture, it's like all of these depictions of school as oppressive, conformist, like it's what, you have to rebel against. And that is a kind of preservative for a democracy, which is this kind of skepticism towards school, towards teachers, towards the authority of teachers. So, you see this in like sort of teen movies from the 20th century. I mean, like Ferris Bueller's Day Off is kind of the canonical movie of rebelling against your stupid, high school teachers and the banality of high school. But there's a kind of ethic. I mean, I think it actually runs pretty deeply in our sort of literary culture. And you see it starting with Benjamin Franklin, who writes, in his autobiography is a kind of account of his education. And it features very little schooling. He had 2 years of schooling and the rest he did himself. And it's sort of like the canonical account of American self-education. And, I think you see it, you can trace a kind of line from Franklin, who's not anti-school, like he funds schools. He helps to found the University of Pennsylvania. He founds the academy, which is basically like a high school that's like attached to the University of Pennsylvania, later absorbed into the University of Pennsylvania. So he donates money to schools. So it's not that he's anti-school, but he sees schools as not really the whole source of education, or they should not be the whole source of education. And you see the same thing, Mark Twain's books later, Louisa Alcott's like Little Women, right? They don't really go to school. I mean, one of them goes to school, but it's not good for her. She's already so vain, and it makes her even vainer. But they basically, like, their education happens, with each other, the sisters, in their attic. They like write plays, they write poems. This is really where they're being educated. And school is just like this place you go to like learn to read or something like that. right? It just doesn't have this kind of centrality in their understanding of education. Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn especially, there's a kind of real animus towards school. And it turns out that like reading and writing are useful to them. They like kind of realize, both Huck and Tom realize at some points that like it's a good thing that they learn to read and write. But basically, like there's nothing else good to be said about school. And so this attitude towards school, we see it in Henry Adams. You see it then in all of this 20th century film and television and stuff. This attitude towards school where it's like we recognize that we need it for these basic skills, which is exactly what Locke and Rousseau.
Right.
We do need to be literate. We do need to be numerate. If our parents can't teach it to us, somebody's got to teach it to us. But we don't take it to be morally authoritative.
Right.
Right. And that really we understand our education as something that happens with our friends outside of school and often like against what we're taught in school. So I think that's kind of the American solution, which is also a kind of fragile solution. But if you think about, Western Europe, East Asia, the attitudes towards school there are very different than our attitudes. They're much more, respectful of teachers. Teachers have a lot of status, social status in society, right? They're like, school matters a lot. The outcomes of school matter. For us, like that's more and more the case that the outcome, the grades you get, where you get into college, all of these things matter more for your life outcome. But for most of American history, that was not at all the case. Like nobody went to college. It didn't matter if you did well in school. That wasn't going to determine anything about your life, in the future. And maybe in some ways that was like a more salutary situation for democracy, that you didn't have this kind of intense determinations based on, life determination based on school, because that, of course, elevates the authority of school, which is, I think, what Franklin, especially, who saw this tension very clearly, had read Locke and read Rousseau, was worried about, that we would treat the institution of school as this really authoritative thing and conform to it.
Yeah, you kind of answered my follow-up, which is who's to say that not respecting school is necessarily a bad thing? I'm a little bit playing devil's advocate here, but it just seems like again, with the congruence thing, like if your goal is to train Americans who are going to be, independent, and in the case of Benjamin Franklin, inventors and all this other stuff, training them from the outset that you're going to have authority, but you shouldn't put it on a pedestal, you could argue is helpful.
Yeah, I think the problem in the United States is that we don't really, and Tocqueville saw this very clearly, is it's very hard for us to justify authority even in the family.
Yeah.
Because the family doesn't have the kind of resources that the aristocratic family had. Like, in the very sort of last ditch thing that Locke offers for parental or especially paternal authority is like, ultimately your father controls the estate. And he can decide not to give it to you if he doesn't like you, right? So there's that's like the last, resort. It's that, he doesn't say that's how you should lead. You should lead by making your son love you and respect you. But like, if you can't do any of those things, right, you can withhold the estate from him and you can withhold his inheritance. And that should be an incentive to him to comply and obey. But in the United States, we don't have an estate. We don't have an inheritance. We don't have these kinds of things to sort of sustain parental authority. And so it is the hardest thing to sustain. And this alternative that I'm sort of articulating that starts with Franklin and runs through Twain and Alcott and all of these other thinkers is, it's not an authoritarian alternative. It's that you turn to your friends rather than you turn to other adults, because there aren't enough adults around. And there aren't reliable adults. And a lot of adults, especially in like Franklin's autobiography, a lot of adults are like frauds and crooks, and they're trying to take advantage of your youthful naivete. And so it's very hard to find adults to trust who are going to sort of invest in you. And so because of that, it's other, it's basically your own friends that you have to make friends, and then you have to sort of turn to them for your education, and you sort of work together to educate each other. And that's not a hierarchical sort of solution. That's like a pretty egalitarian solution. So I think it becomes, even more difficult. I think we have a situation, the American middle class today has a situation where the family can exert more authority. Franklin, there were 17 children in his family. His father was the candle maker. Like, this is a very difficult situation if you want to exert authority. But, here we're living in a world of middle-class families who they do, parents work, but they have, only 2 or 3 kids. And they're not so strapped for money that they are constantly working. So there's more of a kind of control over your children. You see your children more, you're able to sort of interact with them more. But it's still difficult, I think, to justify in the United States. It's a really, on the one hand, you need to develop self-control. On the other hand, there aren't a lot of organic ways in a democracy to do that.
I mean, it's interesting because some of the ways, I mean, these discussions of how much should you draw authority from the people around you, it feels very kind of like Lord of the Flies-esque, and you would think that given that these philosophers are so skeptical of that would be, I mean, if you really hold the view that like the worst possible thing is to draw authority from your peers, that's pretty damning for democracy. And it's interesting that you brought it up because I think that kind of is, you're right, it is the situation we're in. People are drawing a lot of authority from their peers. But
well, I think we have to distinguish between peers and friends.
Okay.
So the way that Franklin does this, right, is you find specific individuals who are like you. And we have these, I mean, in Franklin's case, he calls himself a bookish lad. He has these bookish tendencies. And obviously, like most boys are not like that. And it's, in fact, he finds his few friends in Boston first and then in Philadelphia. And they see each other as against the world. It's like our little group, we are, reading, Cato's letters or something like that, a little bit more elevated than whatever most teenagers are reading today. But that was the popular reading of the time. We're reading this. We are like perfecting our writing skills. We're exchanging letters. And like all these other guys are out there drinking in the pub. Right. So it's not like my peers at large. That's why the peers group of the school is a problem. But it's the friend group that you carve out of that. And it's the same thing you can see in like Little Women, right? So it's like their family. They have these 4 sisters, right? Their friend, and everybody else is on the outside. And they, it's not like all of us, 16-year-olds or something like that. And it's the same thing with Huck and with, Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer, where it's like, Tom Sawyer has selected, like the 7 boys that he's going to hang out with in the woods. And all these other fools who like care about going to school or, those people we're against them. So there's a sense in which you kind of create this isolation and separatism, but you do it with people your own age rather than with adults who do it for you. So, I mean, I think that's like a key distinction. It's not about like, the being part of your class or your school. That's what the sense in which you oppose your school, right, is because you have your own friends and you're different and you have, you're against them.
I mean, we can't all be different, can we?
No, you're the same as your friends, right? But the sense of like, I'm separate, the school is nefarious. The school is kind of the enemy, right? It's not like I have class spirit, right? It's that me and my friends are getting what we need from this school, right? We're getting literacy or numeracy, or we're learning whatever it is we need to learn. And then ultimately, though, our education is taking place together with each other. And that education is this thing that is much bigger than schooling.
Gotcha.
And I think that's very hard for us now to sustain too, is that distinction, because we tend to think of schooling as basically the entirety of education, right? And it's like so long that it like effective. I mean, it's hard not to say that it's the entirety of education if you're like, graduating from, med school at 30 and you've been in school your whole life. So it's very easy, I think, to conflate those two things and say schooling is education. And as schooling becomes more and more imperial, like it just takes over more and more aspects of people's lives and more things get sort of brought into schooling that used to be outside of it, it's a lot easier to make this mistake and say, yeah, this is education. Like school teaches me like how to take care of my body. School, there's health class, there's like financial literacy class, there's, all of these sort of life skills classes folded into schooling. And so, yeah, that's obviously education. But I think that the original distinction, that schooling is not education, that comes out of Locke and Rousseau, is, I think, becoming harder and harder for us to sustain because of that.
Interesting. I mean, I'm still caught on the detail, like, by inherently, the entire school is not Ferris Bueller's. There's one Ferris Bueller, and the same with
he has
all these
two
other
friends.
Right. But whatever. I mean, we can't all be the exception, right?
Yeah, but with your friends, you always feel that you are, right? And it is democratic to say, like, friendship is a democratic possibility, right? Which is in the sense that everybody can, I mean, not everybody does, but everybody can make friends.
Right.
And that you feel in your friend group something separate from this larger entity of the school, that you don't think that all of your friends, everybody at your school is interchangeable. These people are your friends. They have
Right.
something in common with you. And there is a kind of natural social antagonism among these little groups, even in like a non-nefarious way in a regular classroom where people basically get along. You prefer your friends to the rest of the group. So I think that's like actually a fairly democratic solution. I mean, it's not totally inclusive, right? Like
Right.
the inclusive birthday party that my children have to have, right? You have to invite everybody in the class to the birthday party. Like that's fine when they're little, right? They don't really make these distinctions. But that sort of ideology or this mentality that like everybody has to be in everything really crushes the possibility of having these friend groups that separate themselves, that help you to develop something outside of and maybe even against school and give you a broader conception of what education could potentially be.
Gotcha. So I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about rights, which is a favorite Enlightenment topic and very much at a touchstone right now. I mean, because initially, and you've kind of talked about this, there are these movements for children's rights. At this juncture now, there are movements for parents' rights. And it seems like your book very much touches on both. I mean, these two ideas, children's rights and parents' rights, where do they come from ideologically?
Well, I mean, both of them come from much later than the period that I'm examining.
But in the root of, the instinct on both of them, I guess I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, Locke's sort of understanding is that the state has to leave the family alone in
Right.
order for the family to do the work that he's sort of exhorting it to do, right? So it's really, in order for you to sort of retreat to your country estate and educate your own children, there's a sense in which the state can't be mandating what you're doing, right? But you also have a certain duty to produce a certain kind of citizen for the state, right? And so there's a tension there, which is that the state can't enforce the thing it most needs, which is a certain kind of civic education of the sort that Locke is describing. Of course, like you could retreat into your country estate and do the opposite of what Locke is describing, right? And then there would be a problem, but the state would be sort of, without the resources to do anything about it. So there has to be this high level of trust, and this works more in an aristocratic liberalism like Locke's than it does in democratic liberalism. So, you could say there's an idea of parents' rights kind of implied in Locke, although he certainly would never articulate such a thing, which is simply the understanding that the state has to stay out of the family in order for the family to do its job correctly and effectively. But, that's not every family is going to be the aristocratic family. And Locke has a different treatise on education for the poor. And it's like, well, you put them in a warehouse and then they're taught the following things for 8 hours a day. And then they go and they work in the factory or whatever. I mean, there weren't no factories yet, but anticipating this point, right? So it's not that you leave them be and you let their parents decide, because their parents aren't going to do anything. Their parents don't have the means to help them, right? So already, he doesn't try to bring these two things together or systematize them he doesn't have a conception of mass society, right? So you could just make these two separate recommendations for these two separate classes and leave it at that. Rousseau is a little bit more, I think, prescient in that he sees that, one of the things he says is you have to educate your son to have potentially the lowest position in society, because you don't know what's going to happen in the future. Social classes are moving around, and you can't think that your son, because you're an aristocrat, is going to be an aristocrat. The situation may change. It's very prescient because, 30 years later, it does radically change. So he has this understanding, so Emile gets educated to be a carpenter. Right. You need to educate. And Locke has a little bit of this too, because he also thinks you should educate aristocratic boys in like sort of common trades. Not so that they can make a living, though, just because like this is good knowledge to know. And Rousseau says, well, really, he might need to make a living as a carpenter. You don't know. So there is a sense already that society is kind of is at least will in the future be more mobile. And so everybody should have the same education. It's a kind of Emile-esque education, because that actually should fit you out for any class or any role that you find yourself in. But of course, like the means to getting it are not available to everybody. It's not really a real proposal in that sense. So I think, there is a sense that there is going to be a mass society, maybe, or, some inklings of that. But when you really have a mass society, as we start to have in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, when you get the rise of children's
Right.
rights and sort of parents' rights and these kinds of debates, that's when you really have to face this problem, because you've got to have a uniform law, but there are different sorts of families out there. And you've got to allow the state to say, like, well, there's certain kinds of parenting that we can't tolerate. And where do we draw the line? And I mean, I think it's just like an enormously difficult problem that has plagued the entire 20th century and, continues, is chasing us still today. And you could say both of these claims come out of Locke, because for Locke, like, children don't owe anything to their parents. It's all, parenting, the right, you have parents' rights in the sense that the state can't interfere with you or shouldn't interfere with you. But what is it that they're not interfering with? They're interfering with your fulfillment of your parental duties, which are like always in the best interest of children, not in the best interest of parents.
Right.
So all obligation flows from parents to children for Locke. And it's like, children have a right to their inheritance. Children have a right to an education. Children, I mean, he doesn't say it in those words, but it's like, that's what you owe to children. And they don't really have a duty or an obligation of obedience. You have to cultivate that in them. That's like the big challenge in Locke, is you've got to make them voluntarily obedient to you, because you don't have any means of enforcing that obedience on them. And so the state has to stay out, but you basically have to do all these things for your children. And so that, again, that immediately raises the question, well, what if you're negligent in doing these things for your children, right? Then have you violated their rights? And if you violated their rights, then who is going to be the entity that enforces their rights, right? And so we come up with, of course, the state will be the entity that enforces their rights, like the only other thing left. But yeah, then you have another problem, which is that Locke says, well, if the state gets involved, then you can't really do these things correctly. So Locke sort of creates this tension in his account of the family. This is all in the second treatise. This is not the treatise on education. And we're sort of stuck working it out. And we have, leaned more towards parents' rights at various points, sometimes more towards children's rights, or we try to balance these things. But there's sort of a fundamental tension in having the state be the enforcer.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it reminds me, of the beginning of our conversation when we were talking about, parallels between the sort of authority for the state and the family. I mean, I guess now would be a good time to maybe incorporate Rousseau into that discussion, because my understanding from your book is that he's saying, right, that there are scenarios in which the school kind of replaces the family. Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, I mean, Rousseau doesn't really have an account. I mean, he talks about convent schools and things like that. I mean, he sees sort of modernity, or what he calls bourgeois society, as, lots of things start to replace the family because the family falls apart in it.
Interesting. Okay.
And so, he sees the convent school as a problem because it corrupts girls' morals in the same way that, Locke sees the boarding school or the public school or whatever as a problem, because you send children away from the family. They live in this school. They just live with other boys, or in this case with other girls. What kinds of things can they possibly learn from this?
Right.
So it's not so much, I mean, I don't think he sees it as a wide scale replacement of the family.
Right,
He sees everything as undermining the family. Society, high society, fashion, all of that undermines the family, because women don't want to sacrifice themselves to the family. They don't want to stay home. They want to be part of society. They want to run these salons. And because they're not willing to sort of limit themselves, to impose these limitations voluntarily on themselves, that undermines the family. Then, of course, the men run off and, sleep around, and then you can't really have love in the family. The children are sent off to some school, right? Nobody loves each other. It's just a kind of empty formal institution. I mean, that's sort of what he describes in book 1 of the Emile.
Yeah, brutal. And in some ways, I don't know, again, kind of in some ways kind of prescient. I think they're definitely, certainly on the right, a lot of people who would say that is actually kind of what happened.
Yeah, I mean, he's a sort of, reactionary when it comes to the question of women. But I think there's a real internal logic to what he's arguing for, which is that the family is not an organic institution. And I mean, it's organic, but it's not like what would be the word, spontaneous institution.
Right. Interesting.
Once you have a kind of, modernity in which there are these cities like Paris, and there is, they're controlled by fashion, and there's luxury, and all of these, there's commerce, all of these factors are at play, then the family becomes more, at least spontaneously would sort of empty out because there's all these temptations outside of it.
Mm.
And so the only way to sustain the family is through this kind of voluntary self-limitation that women have to impose on themselves, and men too. I mean, it's not like Emile has like this really exciting social, like he doesn't get to do anything fun either, right? They both have to, in a sense, commit themselves to the family, remove themselves from society, turn against all of those temptations for the sake of raising their children correctly. So there is a kind of, self-sacrifice that's required, and that doesn't really harmonize with modern feminism. And so in that sense, Rousseau is reviled. But I don't think that if you look at what he offers men, it's like all that much more free.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting also. I mean, I think there are a lot of ways about how Rousseau discussed women, at least as you discuss them in your book, that really stuck with me. And it's interesting to me that in the end, uh, you think he's proposing Sophie's education as like the
Hmm.
education, the woman's education. I mean, can you talk a little bit about that? Because that to me was kind of out of left field.
Yeah, I mean, he has the book is called Emile.
Right.
It's about Emile, right? And mostly it has been read as being an education for Emile, the boy. And then, there's book 5, and it's like an afterthought. Well, it turns out Emile needs a wife. So what are we going to do? We're going to like conjure up this woman, and here's what her education would be like briefly, and then she'll be perfect for Emile. And I think that, Rousseau is doing a lot of different things. I mean, Emile is, in a sense, his greatest book. It's in the most complex book that he wrote. And he's trying to do a lot of different things in it. And so, there's a tendency among scholars to try to assimilate all of Rousseau's work into sort of one explanation, like he is a Republican,
Hmm.
or, he cares about the philosophical life more than anything, or he cares about the civic life more than anything. And that is not really possible because that's not what Rousseau is trying to do. I think Rousseau is trying to work with he's trying to understand the dilemma of modernity
Right.
and what are the options once we're in modernity and we can't go back, right? What options do we have to sort of work out the contradictions, the self contradictions, the internal contradictions psychologically that modernity sort of forces on us? And there are several options. Like there isn't just one answer, and there are different kinds of people with different kinds of dispositions who are inclined towards one more than the other, right? So he gives, the social contract is kind of the civic option, right?
Hmm.
It's like, well, what we do is we try to recreate a kind of ancient polity or an ancient city, and sort of make it a whole, and that's our whole, and we're just parts of it, and we become sort of uber citizens. And that's, if you look around, there are people who have this like deep desire for that, and that they're attracted to that. And then there's another alternative, which is that you abandon society. Society is corrupt. Other people are corrupt. You just have to sort of go off and figure out how to build yourself.
Yeah.
And that's a solitary option. And there are probably a lot fewer people who have that deep desire, but there are some. And then I think that Emile kind of represents a third alternative, which is this, the family is a semi-stable but not very stable alternative where you can create a small society within a larger society, that you sort of ignore the larger corrupt society and you focus on the small society and make that sort of the purpose of your life. And there can be a kind of self-consistency in living for your family that is not available in being a kind of citizen of one of these corrupt commercial modern states. And so Sophie kind of represents the education for that, because what Emile represents is really natural education. And one of the things that I argue, I mean, this is contentious, but some people sort of argue this, is that Emile's education is a failure. That what Rousseau sets out to do, which is to make a man who is good for himself and good for others, is impossible, because he can only be good for himself or good for others. And that's sort of what Emile's education amounts to. It turns out that he's really not that good for others. If you have the kind of education that, so like there are all these problems at the end, like the tutor never leaves. They beg the tutor at the end, stay with us. Like we're not ready to raise our own child. But that's not supposed to be the outcome. It's supposed to be the case that the tutor is a temporary sort of assistant. Or, there's other problem, which is that if you think about what does Emile know about how to raise a child,
Hmm.
right? It's like nothing, because he's not really taught to care about these kinds of questions. He doesn't understand other people from their perspective, because for him to be taught to understand them that way would corrupt him. And it's Sophie who's actually taught all of these things. I mean, in a way, part of what Emile's education is like a kind of, there's all these secrets that he's not told. And that's the way that he can be self-consistent and sort of whole, right? Which is by not caring about what other people think. Well, in order to not care what other people think, he kind of just doesn't care about other people.
Right.
And he doesn't understand what's going on in their minds, because probably what's going on in their minds is like low and base and not worth his time. But it's a consideration if you try to think about where you're going to fit in society. So what I argue is that Sophie's education doesn't lie to her. That in so many ways he describes her education, he almost exaggerates how enslaved she is to opinion, right? But all he's really saying is, like, in contrast to Emile, she understands that, where do other people's opinions come from? What are they judging you for? Why do those judgments make any internal sense to them, right? And yeah, it's all base, but you have to know it in order to see where you stand and what you need to do to get the things you want from these people. Right. And so Emile is just totally ignorant of it all. And Sophie knows the truth. Sophie knows that, like, Emile is being judged, that, there are people who think this and that about Emile, and that they might not do certain things for him because they think this and that about Emile. So she understands that. And so the point of knowing it is so you can manipulate it. Right. And that's the kind of education that Sophie's given. She's informed about everything. She's informed about how society works, how people form their opinions, how base and vulgar they are. And in order that she can manipulate it to her in her interest. And that's really important for raising children, because you have to understand how they see themselves relative to other people. And Emile doesn't understand that. So if you think about, well, what is a kind of, what is Emile's education trying to do? Emile's education seems to be trying to reveal something about human nature, right? That's a kind of philosophical inquiry into what humans are like and how they develop and how their minds develop. But Sophie is a kind of practical account of, well, if you want to get by, if you want to make the family a kind of refuge in a corrupt commercial bourgeois state, right, you actually have to know how that corrupt commercial bourgeois state is corrupt, and what its corruption consists of, and why you're trying to get away from it. And that's what Sophie knows. So Sophie is kind of, at the end, the practical reiteration of Emile, right? Emile is not practical. It's not meant to be done. It's a big mistake by a lot of pedagogues in Switzerland and other places in the 19th century to try to do it. And the first sign of the mistake that they made is that they said, like, okay, let's just build schools where we teach the pedagogy that Rousseau, propounded in Emile. Well, Rousseau said, don't build schools. So, that was their error, is they take Emile to be a kind of practicable model. But it's really Sophie who's the practicable model. And it is less good in the sense that it's less self-consistent, less pure. In the sequel, I don't know how much value we ought to give to the sequel, but I talk about it a little bit in my book. She's the one who falls, who gives in to temptation in Paris,
right,
and has an affair. So it turns out, like, that's education did not really fully fortify her against every temptation. But I mean, I think the point about the family that Rousseau just makes over and over again, I mean, he makes the same point in Julie, is it's really fragile. It's a solution, but it's based on all kinds of circumstances that you can't control. Like, what if one of your children dies? Right? What if this these things are just out of your control. And because they're out of your control, they're more dangerous, right, than relying fully on yourself, which you have some control over. Right? So the family is a fragile solution. It falls apart. It's based on certain contradictions that are less contradictory than the contradictions of the larger society, but are still contradictory. And so in the sequel, Emile's family falls apart. In Julie, she dies / kills herself. It's sort of ambiguous situation, right? But Rousseau never tries to advance the family in the way that, like, today social conservatives often do. Right. It's just like this foolproof solution, right? He says it's one solution, and it's subject to certain, vagaries of fate, and you can't control those things. And so you can try for this, but you can't fully count on it, right? But the same is true of politics, and the same is true even of solitude, which is like, your body may fail you, your mind may fail you, like, you don't really control everything.
Yeah. I mean, we're just about at time here. It's interesting because, I mean, knowing what I know about Rousseau, which I'll admit is not that much, but it feels a little bit autobiographical, to be honest, like the way that you're discussing it and this nervousness about
having family.
Well, I mean, his family life is like a lot more disastrous than, Emile and Sophie or Julie, but
Yeah.
he doesn't even really try to have a family.
No.
The autobiography of Rousseau. People are
It's
always
a big
bringing this
topic.
up. They're like, "Oh, he abandoned his children. What does he have to say about education?"
Yeah.
But I'm not really sure that's like a totally valid critique.
Fair.
Like he can understand other people
Yeah.
without actually being very good to them.
Right.
There's obviously there are certain autobiographical elements. I mean, the Confession of the Savoyard Vicar is often thought to be a sort of autobiographical account of his religious conversion. But it's hard to say how far that goes, and I wouldn't want to push it too far.
All right. Well, this has been super interesting. Thanks so much for your time. I'm excited for the upcoming book on this stuff. It should be really interesting. And thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Well, there you have it, Madisonians. Rita Koganzon on liberal states, authoritarian families. Her book is in the show notes. And again, I'd really encourage you to reach out and follow us on Twitter at Madison Program, Instagram, Facebook, or our website, jmp.princeton.edu. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time here on Madison's Notes.